I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds, welcome to my horror house. This week in the UK at least saw the home video release of Dr. Sleep, Mike Flanagan's adaptation of the Stephen King novel, a film I had wholly intended and really wanted to see in the theatre, but events conspired against me and it had a relatively short run, so I'm very sorry to say I wasn't able to contribute towards the movie's box office, which I understand was disappointing. For my sins, I've actually been rewarded with being able to watch the full 3-hour director's cut rather than the 2.5-hour version that was in the cinemas. So, you know, it's an embarrassment of riches. And I think right off the top, we should be grateful that Warner Brothers apparently all along allowed Mike Flanagan to make the movie he wanted to, on the understanding it would be too long to release theatrically, but we will definitely release it at home. So I will be talking about the director's cut, the only version of Dr. Sleep that I've seen. I've not read the Stephen King novel, and I'll tell you for why, even though that was a follow-up to The Shining. I read the synopsis and read about the True Knot, a group of psychic vampires that travel the United States in Winnebagos, and I thought, that sounds like a pretty dumb idea. I'm not sure why this film didn't do well, because it's really quite astonishingly good. I'm gonna ramble probably a little for this video because I've got a lot of different thoughts about lots of different aspects of Dr. Sleep, and some of them are contradictory. At turns I will think that this is a phenomenal achievement and a movie I will return to again and again and again. And there are other aspects of the movie and the story it's based on that I think about and go, no, that didn't work at all. That's so way off the mark that this film is actually dumb and boring. So please try and bear with me. I'm trusting that if you're watching this, you at least know the story of Dr. Sleep, and hopefully you've seen the film at the very least. I caught myself up on the synopsis of the book online and appreciate that once again Stephen King has a Shining Universe film that deviates from his novel and actually ties back in to Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining. So we have this weirdly shaped literary and cinematic world that comes together and pulls apart in various different ways, and all we ever really know is that Stephen King still hates Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. We'll never get over that. Personally, I wish he would just get off the pot on that one. Just get over it or shut up about it. We know already, Grandpa King. However, what Mike Flanagan has done with this movie seems to have been quite a remarkable job of adapting a source novel, and from what I've read about what happens in the novel, in my humble opinion, improve upon it, whilst at the same time allow it to cleave to Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of his original novel of The Shining as well, so that the movie also can stand on its own 2 feet and act as a sequel to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. What then, in the final analysis, you get out of Dr. Sleep may well depend on what you had hoped it was bringing to the table in the first place. Were you expecting a sequel to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining? In which case there's an awful lot of stuff that isn't going to interest you. Were you expecting an adaptation of Stephen King's book? And I know there are people very vocal out there who hate, like King, hate Kubrick's version. I imagine that they read the book first and hate the changes and deviations it made, in which case Dr. Sleep may well in parts annoy you with its adherence to accepting Kubrick's version of The Shining as something still in existence and actually canonical. And if your only knowledge of The Shining is the Stanley Kubrick movie, then you may well be saying, who on earth in their right mind sequelizes a Stanley Kubrick film in the first place? As a matter of fact, this weekend we watched Peter Hyams' 2010, the year we made contact. Off the top of my head, the only other filmmaker who's attempted to sequelize a Stanley Kubrick movie. And again, 2010 is an adaptation of a novel, Arthur C. Clarke's, who wrote the novel of the first movie. And like 2010, it has taken a stark, spiky, intellectual, difficult to grapple original movie that also happens to be held up as an example of cinema, the cinematic art at its very best. 2001, often cited as the greatest science fiction film ever made. The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, often cited as the greatest horror film ever made. I disagree about that, but that's by the by. And both of them have sequels which are, I think, play better to larger audiences, are a little bit more audience friendly, but retaining enough of the DNA of Kubrick's original film that they're also in their own different ways challenging, intellectually exercising, emotionally satisfying. There are two films almost at work here in Dr. Sleep. There's The Shining 2, for want of a better term, and there's Stephen King's X-Men. And I have to say, I dug them both. I'm just not 100% sure I dug them both in the same movie. Bear in mind, this is me talking about a movie I really enjoyed and haven't stopped thinking about since I saw it on Monday, and fully intend to watch again very, very soon because I want to return to it. It has its own sort of hypnotic, somnambulistic languor to it, its own pace, especially over 3 hours. I watched the 3-hour version and it didn't feel like 3 hours, crucially. And I also wasn't really sure, well, what precisely would I cut out of this? There were a couple of scenes that I thought, all right, if I had to trim it for time, these could probably go. But this felt like a complete story, a complete film, and the 3-hour journey went absolutely like that. Critically, the reason I think it's a success on its own terms, although a qualified success, is that Mike Flanagan makes it hypnotic in his own way, using his own techniques. He doesn't fall back. It must have been so tempting to fall back on all the techniques Kubrick had employed in the first film and use them all as crutches. But instead, Flanagan has his own language for Dr. Sleep. It is a language, again, of repetition, but it's repetition of different things. The heartbeat motif that comes in certainly doesn't hurt with the hypnotic quality. But rather than long takes and steadicam shots and things like that, instead there's the repeated motif of fading from one image into another, but the image you're fading into being slightly pushed in on the one that you've seen, giving this, there's an awful lot of astral and psychic projection going in on the film. So there's all throughout the film, as the viewer, we're woozily in a place and then just pushing in closer, just pushing in closer. That's being repeated along with the heartbeat sounds, and also then the title cards being added for the director's cut, the chapters. When chapter 1 came up, I must admit, I initially thought, so we're doing this, are we? But again, with repetition, I found myself acclimatizing to the rhythm of the film and came to really appreciate these title cards and these chapter titles. And they get placed in very strange places during the film. Not the beats in the film where you might expect them to come as well. So there's a languor and there's a feel to Dr. Sleep, all its own, that doesn't owe a debt to Stanley Kubrick's film. And that is to be applauded. Yes, there are times when shots from Stanley Kubrick's film are replicated. Some of them are replicated exactly. An awful lot of them aren't. And when they are, it's for reasons, and when they aren't, it's for other reasons. All of them artistic, and all of them to tell the story, I feel, of Dr. Sleep, rather than to say, look, we're making a sequel to The Shining. that approach may well indeed have made them more money. I'm really glad that they went the kosher route that's got a little bit of heart and soul and artistic integrity to it, for what it's worth. So you do get elements that, as a shorthand, I called The Shining 2. Ewan McGregor is Danny Torrance, now grown up, Dan Torrance. He is, as his father was, struggling with alcoholism, really struggling. We find him at a dark place, and where I guess The Shining is a story about a man being consumed by his addictions. Dr. Sleep, in part, is a story about how cycles of violence breed violence, but Dan's trajectory is one of redemption. He has more to him than maybe Jack Torrance did, or different breaks, or a different support network, and he is able to take his arc out of rock bottom as we join him. The bits that harken back to his childhood and the time at the Overlook Hotel and after, I really liked, and not just the bits where shots were replicated and the like. We get to see scenes between Wendy and young Danny after the Overlook, the aftermath of it. The actress who plays Wendy, I'm going to have to put her name here because I forget it, does an absolutely bang up job of mirroring the performance from the first film. It's eerie, but the elements I really liked were oh my goodness, when Dan talks about his father at the AA meeting when he gets his 8-year sober token. It's wonderful. The subtlety of Ewan McGregor's performance as someone who won't put himself out there, put himself forward. He's in a group, he's actually still scared to speak up. He's kept his personality and his abilities locked down and safe because he's still in hiding mode. He doesn't want to speak up. He doesn't want to be present in his own life, and that reticence and fear is still there. Even after decades, this lingering after effect of the trauma that he suffered is portrayed absolutely beautifully by Ewan McGregor. I think that is a performance that will reveal hidden depths and untold riches upon rewatch that other performances in the film aren't asked. Because set up in opposition to Dan, you have the True Knot, this roaming band of psychic vampires led by Rose the Hat, played by Rebecca Ferguson. And if you've come to the film for Dan Torrance and The Shining 2, all the time that you spend with the True Knot can seem really frustrating, and you might just want to get back to Dan's story. I'll be honest with you, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't read the book Dr. Sleep because I thought that the psychic vampire idea sounded nonsense. It still kind of sounds nonsense to me, but weirdly, watching Dr. Sleep, once you get used to the gear shifts, you're going to spend some time with this person, you're going to spend time with Abra, the young girl, you're going to spend time with the True Knot. Once you get used to those gear shifts, I got used to changing lanes and was quite happy in the company of the different people, but each time I got comfortable in a lane, I was asked to shift a lane, and sometimes I got a little bit antsy about being asked to shift lanes so many times. I would sit down and watch a 2-hour True Knot movie by Mike Flanagan with these actors. There were times when I got a little peeved that it took me away from Dan's story, because I guess that's what I brought to the table and what I was invested in the most. That said, I would be lying if I didn't say that I could do with a 3-hour cut of Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat, just doing her stretches or sitting cross-legged or walking around barefoot, astrally projecting places, because I absolutely would watch 3 hours of that. I love Rose the Hat. I love Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat. I just think there's a little bit of oil and water going on between Rose the Hat and Dan Torrance in The Shining 2, which film am I watching? And I have to lay that at Stephen King's feet. This is the story he came up with. The reason we're returning to the young Danny Torrance decades later is because another child who has the ability to shine is at danger of being eaten by psychic vampires who keep themselves more or less immortal by essentially vaping on the soul smoke that escapes from children when they kill them at point of death, typically children who have the ability to shine. I don't think that's a strong enough reason to return to this world. I don't think Dr. Sleep is a book that needed to be written. This sort of near dark light travelling band of vampires is not an urgent enough story for us to return to these characters. If you're coming hoping purely for the tension and the shocks and the scares of The Shining all over again, I think what you'll find is, just as all of Stephen King's creations have now become so tightly bound in with his Dark Tower fantastical works, the world that this movie inhabits now feels more akin to the fantasy horror of the Dark Tower series than it does the stark original horror of The Shining. There are a couple of references to the Dark Tower world in the movie, as you would expect. I'm goddamn sure that they're in the book. I mean, even Mike, is it Mike Halloran? Dick Halloran, beg your pardon, says car is a wheel, and the coach that takes Dan to the place where he finally sobers up is called Tet Transports. So yeah, this ain't really a horror film. It's more, as I say, Stephen King's X-Men. It's one of his fantasy stories. The downside to that is there is absolutely no threat in Dr. Sleep. At no point did I think Dan was ever in any danger. At no point did I think Abra, the girl that he was striving to protect, was ever in any danger, even when she was in the clutches of the True Knot and Dan was many miles away, because all it was a reason for them to employ more psychic shenanigans. As a result, the young lady who plays Abra does an absolutely competent job. I think she's absolutely brilliant when she's playing her physical self, psychically taken over by other people. But the character of Abra that she's given is so confident and cocky in her ability, I guess like a young teenager would be, that she's never scared. There's one moment when she's scared, where at a distance she remote views the True Knot killing another boy, and there's a wonderful shot that Mike Flanagan recreates from the original film. Remember the shot where Danny is seeing the twins? I can't remember what Danny's seeing in the Overlook Hotel, but it's just the camera on him, and he's doing that. There's a shot where Abra is reacting in the same way to this just abject horror that she's witnessing, that is never achieved again. She's never afraid. Her fucking dad's killed in this movie, and she's never. We never for 1 millisecond wonder. Oh, I wonder if Abra's going to make it to the end of the movie. Of course she is. So this Stephen King's X-Men element of the story. Hey, I liked the Dark Tower stories for the most part. I mean, they become big stinkeroos towards the end, but the world he creates is phenomenal. The tone of that world, it's a world I like visiting. So I liked visiting a tonally sympathetic world again in Dr. Sleep. I didn't feel like, even when we returned to the Overlook, that we were now entering the scary phase of the film. The ghosts of the Overlook Hotel were again just a different set of fantastically supernaturally powered creatures that could do battle. Now, I was waiting for it to happen, and I wanted it to happen. But as soon as Dick Halloran tells Danny how he can neuter the ghosts from the Overlook Hotel who are still reaching out to him, you can predict what's going to happen at the end of the movie. No one is going to be shocked by what happens. So what does happen, at least in my experience, is then you spend the next 3 hours waiting for that to happen. I turned to my other half and said, when they start their road trip and they're going across these sort of sun-blasted American landscapes, I said to Hannah, I want, in fact, if we've spent 2.5 hours getting to this point and then we don't transition into the opening shots of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining when they get to Colorado, and if the music doesn't come in at this point, I think we will have wasted our time. And to be fair, that is exactly what happens. It's nighttime instead of daytime to differentiate it, which is absolutely fine, but there's enough. I'll be honest, I punched the air. I know it's fan service. I know it's absolute fan service. I know that recreating the Overlook Hotel is 100% fan service. Only made possible because the fucking thing didn't burn down in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. I think the ending of the movie, from what I've read about the ending of the book, is stronger. It makes it feel more like, I'll be honest with you, Dan is overcoming past traumas, facing the real, some of the real source of his trauma, the conversation he has with his father. I've read that in the end of the book, Jack Torrance comes to his son's aid, and I think it is superior. I was expecting that as well. I think Wendy finally coming at the very end is... I think it's superior. I think it's much more emotionally resonant, and I just thought that was a beautiful touch, I've got to be honest. So in short, too late. There are times when this movie gave me chills because of the way it had grown out of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. There were times when this movie gave me chills of excitement because we were in this fantastical, much more mid-worldy type Stephen King environment. The scene where Rose the Hat astrally projects herself into Abra's room and they have that confrontation is just sublime. I could watch that over and over and over again. But at the same time, that culminates in Abra putting herself in Rose the Hat's mind and riffling through her little mind palace of memories. To what end? What does she learn there? Does that ever aid them? No. There's no threat. It's certainly not scary. There's never any consequence to anything that happens other than just a load of honestly cool shit. And there are only ever genuine emotional beats when Dan is either struggling with his past or ascending beyond it. The section where he becomes Dr. Sleep is so heartfelt. It's wonderful. And then he stops being Dr. Sleep because the story needs him to stop being Dr. Sleep. And I think that's a stupid name for a book anyway. And I certainly think calling it Dr. Sleep hurt the film. I clearly have a complicated relationship with a film that I clearly have an awful lot of time for. I'm very eager to watch it again. And maybe some of these, what I see as disparate elements will settle down more cohesively. I think what's to be applauded is that Mike Flanagan didn't just make a flat-out sequel to Stanley Kubrick's movie using all of those visual tricks and tics. He has made a movie all his own, which has sprung from the well of Stephen King's imagination and Stanley Kubrick's movie. And if only Stephen King himself could get beyond this chip he's got on his shoulder about what a filmmaker did in adapting a work of prose into a work of film. But I hear that he's happy with Dr. Sleep. He's happy for everyone else to adapt the shit out of his work. Apart from The Shining. It's never going to not piss him off. Dude, life's too short. Kai's a wheel. Chill the fuck out, man.